Hello, friends, and welcome. Welcome to the Impact Hour. I'm Aura Vasquez, your host, and I am super excited today to host a conversation. Interesting guest from the Center for Climate Integrity. As you know, many of you know that I am an environmental justice advocate, and the issue of climate change, of renewable energy, sustainability is dear to my heart. So, the Impact Hour is a podcast that is committed to bring conversations so that we can all get more educated and take action in our everyday days lives. And today we are counting the costs of the climate impacts on communities. So we're going to have two very special speakers from the Center for Climate Integrity, and they are a nonprofit advocacy group whose mission is to empower communities and elect officials with the knowledge and tools they need to hold oil and gas corporations accountable for decades of lying about climate change. And we will dive deeper on this topic. Through strategic campaigns, communications, and legal support, they ensure that the fossil fuel industry pays its fair share of the massive cost of climate damages. And as we dive into this topic, I want to welcome you. We are streaming live from Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitch, X, and you are welcome to join the conversation by posting your questions and your ideas on the comments. With no further ado, let me introduce you to our speakers of the day. And I want to start by welcoming Kelly Sanks, and she is a climate impact analyst. Kelly is at the Center of Climate Integrity, where she uses science to inform climate models and associated climate adoption costs. Thank you, Kelly, for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk more about this with you.
And I also want to welcome Iyla Shornstein, political director at the Center of Climate Integrity as well, where she oversees the organization's state and local political strategies. Hi, welcome.
Thank you so much.
All right. So this is like my topic of, of preference. I have also been working on the climate space for many years. My story dates, my childhood back in Colombia. So for me, this topic is super important, and I'm so grateful that there is an organization that works on analyzing the other costs that we don't talk about sometimes when it comes to climate. So first, I would love to hear, how did you get involved in this issue, and how did you ended up, with this organization?
Sure. Kelly, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. So I've always been really a fan of being outdoors and being in nature. And I learned a lot about climate change growing up in Chicago. And when I went to do my undergrad, I really wanted to study environmental science to try to make an impact and help with the crisis that we're facing. That led me to pursue a graduate degree in geoscience, where I studied the interaction of river deltas and wetlands and how sea level rise affects coastal communities. And as I was doing that, I got very interested in community science and really helping communities that are facing these problems instead of just publishing kind of like peer-reviewed science. So that ultimately led me to work in the nonprofit space. And that's how I found the Center for Climate Integrity. I have been the climate impacts analyst at CCI for about a year, just under a year now. And it's just been really good to work in this space and see our research really make an impact in local communities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What about you, Iyla?
Yeah. So thank you for the question. My background sort of straddles both the political world and the environmental and climate space. I originally kind of got my start in sustainable food systems work, and I was really focused heavily on local agriculture in the Hudson Valley region of New York, where I'm originally from. I had then always had a love of politics, had done my undergraduate degree in it, and started to get involved in local electoral campaigns. And so my heart felt very split between these two things. I ended up going back to graduate school, but took a very long time to finish it because I kept getting pulled to work on a campaign because that's where my heart was. And my dream was, of course, to always be able to blend the two in some way. I have a master's in environmental policy, and my work in my research in graduate school was really focused on the fossil fuel industry and trying to understand how campaign contributions to members of Congress might influence how they vote on environmental policy. I mean, we all know it happens, but
Big topic.
yeah, definitely a big topic. And, I continued, once I finished, I continued to work on campaigns all over the country. And then found out about CCI and started out just helping as a consultant, and joined the staff about 4 years ago and have never looked back. And it is so exciting because it really is a treat and feels like a perfect nexus of my two loves, which is climate and environmental policy, as well as political organizing.
Wonderful. And I'm so glad that you have that type of expertise, because as someone that has been very involved in politics here in California and nationally, I ran for city council here in Los Angeles just recently. And I see the heavy influence of the money in politics, and also how the hidden cause also. I mean, we're going to talk about this report that you have, but the point that I'm trying to make is that for a lot of us that are climate champions that try to run for office, is a really uphill battle, because the fossil fuel industry also has very tight connections with labor, for example, which is something that in the environmental movement we really support. We want the transition of workers. We want a just transition. We want to make sure that people have jobs when we retire gas plants or coal plants, and we want to make sure that there is an avenue for workers to find employment and retraining and maybe something better, that is more profitable. But it's a very difficult conversation sometimes to have, because they have tentacles that stretch so many places. So I'm glad that maybe we can also weave in some of those conversations about the money and politics, and how this is also affecting our communities here locally and all over. I mean, I feel like when I just saw this map that NASA put out with CO2 emissions, where they show where the emissions come from. And the majority come from the northern hemisphere, Europe, the United States. But the countries where they pay the most for the climate impact is like low income developing, countries in like the southern part of the hemisphere, and then like in the African continent. So it's more to talk about, but I want to dive deeper in this report. Because for a long time people used to say, well, it's too expensive to divest from coal. It costs us too much, to not utilize gas, as a source of power. But now we're realizing that it's more costly because of the health impacts and others. So tell us, Kelly, maybe you can start with just giving us a framework and an understanding of what the report is about.
Yeah, definitely. So we work with an engineering firm, Resilient Analytics, and they help us with all of the climate modeling. But this study looked at 14 different climate costs in Los Angeles County, 2 of which are public health, 12 of which are kind of infrastructure adaptations that will need to be put in place in like the near term to really prevent the most disastrous consequences of climate change. But this report is limited to 14 of these impacts, and there's hundreds of impacts to infrastructure, to public health, to communities across Los Angeles and across the country. And we're only able to look at a small subset of that. So as we're discussing these results, I just really want to highlight that this is just even a limited number of impacts. And we found that the total costs across Los Angeles County was $12.5 billion through 2040. So from now through 2040, to protect against just these 14 impacts.
So 12 billion with a B.
Yeah, billion
Yes.
with a B. Yeah.
Wow. That is
Yeah.
a lot of money. And in your opinion, what would be the top priorities, or the top, hindrances, the top issues that we need to mitigate?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that really comes down to, like, what community you're in and where you live within Los Angeles itself. Obviously, certain communities might want to focus more on combating extreme heat if they're really urbanized, they have high populations of elderly people, unhoused populations, or just people generally at risk for, heat disease. So that's often a very expensive adaptation that has lots of different solutions. So whether that's, increasing green space around the urban area with by planting trees, or whether that's kind of converting either pavements, which we looked at in the study, or rooftops or buildings to be more reflective of sunlight, so essentially painting them with kind of high reflective paint to reflect off that heat and not absorb it into the buildings and into the roads and into the infrastructure in the city to cool down the city. There's lots of different options for that, but that's often a really expensive adaptation across Los Angeles County and just like across the country, that implementing certain adaptations can have really a lot of good impacts for community members that are really susceptible to extreme heat. And then another impact that tends to be really costly and was really costly in Los Angeles County itself was increasing precipitation. So the cost we looked at in the study was essentially increasing the amount of area within a municipality that can actually drain water. So to kind of help combat flooding from extreme storms. So we know we're like facing these atmospheric rain bombs, which is essentially just precipitation that happens really quickly all at once
Rain. We're talking
because
about precipitation is rain. Yes.
yeah, rain. Yeah, so it's just like rains a ton in like a very short amount of time, and the systems that we have in place right now are not used to handling that much water, and so you get really excessive, crazy flooding. Even in places where it is getting maybe drier, you still can get these really crazy rain events. And so increasing the amount of area where that rain can actually drain into the ground instead of run off onto the streets and the concrete um, will help prevent some of that flooding. Obviously,
Mm.
not all of it, but the total cost from the study across Los Angeles County for that impact was $4.3 billion just in this 17-year period. So that's really expensive and can help a lot to really mitigate some of the flooding that we'll experience. So I would say those two, extreme heat and extreme
And
precipitation.
extreme rain.
Yeah.
So, what are the 14 measures that you mentioned? I
Yeah.
think some people in the audience are wondering what are the impacts, or the what is another word that we can use? Or like, yeah, the how do you just,
Adaptations.
yeah, exactly. What were you looking at when you looked at when you were creating the study?
Yeah, I can go through all of them. And then if you have questions on any specific ones, we can dive deeper into them. So I'll just go in order from most expensive to least expensive. Stormwater drainage infrastructure, so increasing the amount of area where you can drain water when it rains, increasing or installing cool pavements to reflect heat, increasing urban canopy. That's just increasing the amount of trees in urban areas. Um, Treating West Nile virus, so increased cases of West Nile virus. Mitigating
I didn't
wildfires.
even know that that was something that could happen from, wow. Okay.
Yeah. With
In
like
Los
increased,
Angeles. We're
yeah,
talking about Los Angeles. Wow.
yeah. Um, yeah, mitigating wildfires, the damage from wildfires. So not preventing wildfires, but kind of mitigating the potential damage. Increasing costs of both heating and cooling, so net building energy costs,
Mhm.
increasing costs of proactive road maintenance, protecting the coastlines from sea level rise, stabilizing bridges to handle larger volumes of water in the streams and the rivers, increased drinking water treatment costs due to drought, increasing cases of pediatric asthma,
Mm.
specifically due to increased temperature. In our study, there's lots of different climate impacts that affect asthma, but the one we looked at was specifically because of hotter temperatures. And then expanding and opening cooling centers to handle more extreme heat events, making the metro rail able to handle hotter temperatures just by painting the tracks with reflective paint. So it prevents essentially slowdowns and shutdowns when the tracks get hot. And then upgrading air conditioning capacity in public buildings.
Thank you. And I mean, these are all of the things that basically you looked at in order to come up with this number.
Yeah, so those 14 impacts, the cost from now, essentially 2024 through 2040, is the cost we're presenting. And that the cost is an increased cost compared to a climate baseline. Now, that kind of might sound a little crazy, like what's a climate baseline? Essentially, it's just we're using a period that's centered around 2000 when we didn't have as extreme of climate change. Climate change was already occurring, but the temperature rise wasn't that crazy as it is now and as it's getting. So we use a period and we estimate how much all of this would cost in that period using climate models. And then we compare the increased costs during our study period. And that's what the estimate is based on. So it really is an increased cost driven by climate change, not just a cost in general.
Wow, this is fascinating. And like I said, when I was organizing the Beyond Coal campaign for the Sierra Club and organizing Los Angeles to get off of coal, we will talk about the other costs, the health costs. For example, when someone has a child and the child has asthma, or them themselves have asthma, and they have to miss days of school and work because their child is sick or can make it, to school. So, and childcare for, kids that are, so like all that public health that sometimes you don't account when you
Yeah,
think
and
about climate change.
yeah, I love that you're making that point because we are very interested in public health. That's like a huge cost. I mean, even losing like one life to extreme heat, like you can't really put a number on that. And so oftentimes assessing those costs like that you're talking about, which are very real and really impactful to people, it's really hard to do in terms of an estimate. So like again, we have this very conservative estimate here, and there's like so many costs, even if they're not the highest dollar amount, they might be the the most impactful cost to just general community members. And that's really like a good point to highlight.
Absolutely. And I guess my follow-up question is for Iyla, to talk about, in this report and given your expertise, how do you see, for example, we're talking about LA County, how have elected officials and decision makers have taken this news of this amount of money that we could maybe be investing in our community, or investing just in general in creating good climate policy to prevent all these issues? I mean, it's a collective effort, right? It's a global effort. But what has been the response from elected officials and decision makers?
Yeah, that's a good question. The response has been a little bit, well, very, I think, eye-opening for folks, because, the way that we've assessed the cost, to your point, it's really looking at the public cost. Like, what is it going to cost a government? What is it going to cost, the people living there paying public tax dollars? So I think what it's done, I think successfully, and was very much our intention, was to start a conversation about who should pay for these costs. Because to your point, decision makers, there is a finite amount of money in a public budget, right? That's just fact. So as climate impacts get worse and they start to get to a place where they're just absolutely going to have to implement some of these adaptations, are they pulling money from school budgets? Are they pulling money from senior centers, from public housing, from fire and rescue? Like, where is that? What is going to have to give in order to make these adaptations, which will be increasingly necessary? So I think it has started that conversation. I think a lot of folks know and have read a lot of, or even participated in like a climate action plan or a climate adaptation plan, but often those don't have price tags attached. So I think now we can really start. And, we know that the study, it is conservative, like Kelly said. It's got a minute or a subset of costs amongst what's going to be much larger. So we also want to encourage elected officials and municipal officials to track their own costs, right? What are we
Mhm.
already spending on climate change each year whenever we have to react to an intense flood or even wildfires, or when schools have to shut down because of air conditioning, like you said, all those costs. So I think it's done two things, which is start a conversation about who should pay. And from where we stand at CCI, we want to make sure those most responsible are the ones paying. And it's also encouraged folks to track their own costs and start thinking about what is this, because everywhere it's going to be a little bit different just due to their own specificity and unique structure.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Thank you. We are talking about counting the costs, the climate impacts on communities with the Center for Climate Integrity. We're here with Kelly Sanks and Iyla Shornstein, who are sharing with us the cost in LA County, and all the billions of dollars that we are basically losing or just spending because of the climate crisis. um, the day that I learned about your report and I was listening to your presentation, you had a community, Zoom of sorts, virtual meeting. I just thought it was fascinating that, for example, right now in Los Angeles, we're going through the budgeting process. And, Controller Kenneth Mejia has warned us of, all of the overspending or the lack of resources that we have here. And you will think that climate will be at the forefront of a lot of policy making, because then you can save all that money and you can reinvest it. And you talked about tree canopy and parks, which is something that I have also worked on locally here in my community in District 10, and the lack of park access and just tree canopy and how that affects making the area hotter, and heat island effect. For those that don't know, maybe this term is the notion that all the asphalt and all the the way that we have designed our streets and our buildings is just making our area hotter. And trees don't only clean the air, but also create shade, which is great. And you know uh, in a shaded area, you don't need to use as much as air conditioning, so it's cheaper for you. But it's not easy sometimes to make this argument with people. It's a long shot. You have to take people through a lot of hoops for them to understand, oh, this is why I need trees. But in your research, and I'm asking both of you can take this question. On your research with this report, what how is the impact in heat in mitigating, I guess, heat in terms of trees and tree canopy?
Yeah, I can start. First, yeah, that's a really good point. It's often in urban areas where you have this urban heat island effect, which is what it's called. So all of the pavement, the buildings, they're just absorbing a ton of heat, and it just stays hot all day and it stays hot at night. Um, and we found in the report that, like, in many areas across the country, this is a pretty well researched thing, that areas like high Hispanic populations across Los Angeles County, high non-Hispanic Black populations, areas with a higher poverty rate, they are the most affected by the extreme heat. So this really is an environmental justice
Mhm.
impact fully, and they often have the least amount of resources to really deal with this. And planting and maintaining trees seems like, oh, that's such like an easy thing, but it's pretty expensive. It's hard to implement, especially when your entire area is urbanized. Those communities, they don't have as much access to green space. So there's a lot that goes into that really is an environmental justice impact. And so when we're thinking about dealing with extreme heat, we really need to be kind of centering the needs of those communities and what
Mhm.
makes the most sense for them to deal with these impacts. So that's what I think what I'll say about that. I don't know if I totally answered the question though.
Well, I think that sometimes the answer is pretty straightforward, which is we need more money for trees and for and
Yeah.
for and for parks and open spaces, I guess. I don't know if you want to add anything, Ayla, to this question around tree canopy and green spaces.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think that like it is sticker shock, right? And we're like, wait, why is it this much? Like it's trees, what? But I
Mhm,
think if we also like use the thought exercise of, well, what happens to folks when we don't do these types of adaptations, when we don't lower the temperatures in these communities? And like Kelly said, of course, there are communities that are going to be much harder hit than others. So
mhm,
I think then we're talking about increased hospitalizations, increased asthma, increased respiratory and cardiac problems, some really, really scary stuff. And I think a really good point was made earlier about, when things close due to heat, sometimes your home, when people have to stay home, sometimes your home is hotter than the alternative. So I do think there's a huge, huge human side to this that, goes far beyond like we should plant more trees and to like,
mhm.
okay, but this is what we're actually trying to protect people from happening or protect people. Yes.
Yeah, and I can
Absolutely. Go
Oh,
ahead.
okay. I can jump in with like I'm an analyst, so I can give you a little statistic that we looked at when we released this report was that it would cost the city of Los Angeles about $28 million per year to increase green space by planting and maintaining trees in
Mhm.
the city of Los Angeles, and that was equal to the city's entire street tree and parkway maintenance budget for 2024. So just this one impact to not remove urban heat islands, but to really help combat some of that temperature rise takes up the whole budget for the street tree and parkway maintenance. So
Wow.
yeah, someone needs to pay for it, and like it shouldn't really be the taxpayers that live in the city because they didn't create the problem.
Absolutely. And and in the topic of heat adaptation at this point, um in parks and open space in trees, in Los Angeles we have places where people can go refuge for the heat, against the heat, cooling centers. And it's amazing to me that our cooling centers are not yet microgrids, which we're now talking about intersectionality between solar energy efficiency, battery storage, which I think has been a game changer in the world of renewable energy, and parks. That a place where that a place in a community that is often used to recreate can now become the refuge, the place where you can refuge. So if you have any information or data around rooftop solar, for example, because microgrids is just, is a system where you have solar panels, you have batteries, and you're independent from the grid. So in the event of a natural disaster, an earthquake, a flood, that you can still charge your phone, you can still communicate with the world, because this place will become it has microgrid technology that will allow you to do these things. So for a long time we have been fighting, and advocating for this type of intersectional solutions in our city, that not only we need parks and we need green spaces, but we also need them to be a place where we can utilize in the event of an emergency. So what were you guys findings in terms of rooftop solar and distributed generation, and and these other renewable energy solutions?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit, Kelly, if you want to add anything. So we did not look at renewables, and we didn't look at like mitigating greenhouse gases, basically. So we're specifically just looking at like what communities are feeling as a result of increased heat and rain. Which, like, I love where you're going with this, because that's the next step, right? Like
Mhm,
we created, I think, a framework on a foundation of, okay, here's what we need to do to just protect people, which is a really basic, I mean, that's a pretty basic priority. We don't want to just
mhm.
protect people. We want them to thrive and to live full and wonderful lives. So what's the next thing you have to add on? And I think you're correct. You're completely correct in that. And it's now like the integration and the intersectionality that goes with renewables. And also just like if you go to a cooling center and you have 4 kids with you and there's nothing to do at that cooling center, like, and then your phone dies, like, what
Mhm.
is that? So I think there is, like, this is what we did, it was complicated, but it's also very basic, and it does need, like, the next people need to come in who have that expertise, because that's, just a little far afield from what we know and are good at, and add those layers on so we can actually get a full picture of, like, what is the true cost, not just to protect communities, to protect them so they thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. And in cities, in urban cities, because I'm sure I'm curious to hear if you have done this study in other cities or in more rural places, in like agricultural places. I'm wondering how is out there, and what's the difference compared to Los Angeles. But another thing that I thought it was fascinating is plain infrastructure. A lot of us drive around in Los Angeles and we see the dilapidated streets, and you talk about this type of infrastructure and how it can be better. There's a lot of ideas out there of permeable asphalt and other practices that can be great. And but again, if we had better climate policies, we could save all those dollars and invest it in this type of infrastructure improvements. So what were some other findings, or have you done other studies in other places, and how similar or different were the findings?
Yeah, Kelly, I'll speak to the other places and then maybe you can speak to some of the other impacts. So yeah, we released a study last summer for the entire state of Pennsylvania, or the Commonwealth of
Mm,
Pennsylvania, looking at all of similar to LA County, where we looked at all the municipalities within. We did the same thing in Pennsylvania. Some of the impacts are really different, right? Like Pennsylvania actually deals with a lot of landslides, although actually I guess LA has some of that, a little bit of that, but like Western Pennsylvania, just as a result of their geology, deals with lots of landslides. But in Pennsylvania, we looked at a slightly fewer cost. We've evolved this every time that we do this kind of study. I think the cost that we looked at was about 15.5 billion, but for about 8 impacts. And I think I have that number right. And we are going to be we're going to be releasing another study next month. So that's really exciting. We're looking at the Midwest, which has a whole bunch of rural flooding issues, and some other impacts that are not necessarily specific to, there's not a coastal community, right? Like they're looking at a huge or different subset of impacts from climate change. But Kelly, maybe you want to speak to a little bit of, I think what was a really good point was like the roads and the bridge damage that was just like these infrastructure needs that are so basic to us to move around.
Yeah, definitely. So we do have impacts that, will just impact every place across the country pretty much, and it's going to be probably expensive everywhere. One of those is roads. When
mm,
you get hotter temperatures, when you get more precipitation, the roads just weren't built to handle those conditions. And so you either need to fix them more often, just like as potholes come up and things degrade, you just fill in the pothole, and then maybe a little bit later, there's another pothole, and then you have to fix it again. Or you could redo the roads to handle the hotter heat and the increased precipitation, which tends to be cheaper in the long run, but not something that is often really implemented in cities. And road impacts, honestly, are pretty severe, whether you're in a rural area or if you're in an urban area. Anywhere that has a lot of increased heat and increased precipitation, the roads are going to just degrade over time because of that. Um, and then another one that is kind of pretty ubiquitous across the country is the bridge stabilization. So anywhere where you have increased precipitation, especially when you have those rain bombs and you have these rivers that are getting a lot more water and they're
right.
just flowing way faster, the bridges are going to be way more susceptible to destabilization. And while that's just like kind of an impact that happens anywhere, the collapse of a bridge might be way more detrimental in one place versus another. So we're kind of assessing these adaptation strategies, but they might have like very, very different impacts. Like it might be super necessary to really fix the bridges in somewhere where you have a lot of traffic, a lot of people, trains carrying deadly chemicals, things like that. Whereas maybe somewhere else where it's kind of just, a smaller bridge, it might not be as pressing to fix it. And then, I guess I would also just say, Los Angeles County and California and the West deals with a lot of wildfires. So that's a new impact that we were able to assess the cost of in Los Angeles County, which we didn't assess the cost of in Pennsylvania because it's not as severe of a problem there yet. Although we did just see this last summer, that smoke from Canada or other wildfires can travel far distances and causes a lot of health impacts. So even though Pennsylvania might not be susceptible right now to like really huge wildfires that kind of devastate infrastructure in Pennsylvania itself, it definitely experiences the health impacts of wildfires. And I think we've kind of seen that, no place in the US now is really void of that impact, and that is from climate change.
Kelly, you just reminded me too that a couple of studies I forgot to mention because I was thinking so specific to locations. So we have this Pennsylvania study, we have this LA study, we're releasing another state study in June, so stay tuned. But we also have a couple of studies that we did nationwide looking at one climate cost in particular. So in 2019, we released a study on the cost of sea level rise to build coastal defenses against it. And that was looking at geographies that touch the ocean as well as tidal rivers. And so that is actually interactive, and you can go and look up your community if you live in a community that is dealing with sea level rise and get that cost. We also, a couple years ago, released a study looking at the cost to install air conditioning in public schools throughout the US. And I think this one is really interesting. I think in places like Los Angeles, where we know that not everyone has air conditioning. We know that, but it's more ubiquitous. When we talk about places like the Midwest or like where I am in the Northeast, where like schools didn't necessarily need air conditioning prior to more recently because students just weren't in school during those times where we have extreme heat. Now that the summers are getting longer and we're dealing with these spikes, it's not safe for students. And it also, doesn't promote a healthy learning environment. So we really looked at the cost, not only to install air conditioning in places that never needed it prior, but also to upgrade air conditioning capacity, as well as to just what's it going to cost to run it either more intensely or more days out of the year.
Yeah. And that brings up a good point. So one of our colleagues, Charlotte, who's a researcher, she sent me a document yesterday that really touches on this point. So in 1988, Shell had an internal report that was found just by journalists and researchers. And it says that local temperature change may necessitate local adaptation of buildings in which people live and work, technologies for heating or cooling, energy sources for heating and cooling, new food preparation technologies, new cultivation techniques, etc. And all such adaptations are costly, and some would drastically change the way people live and work. So just to bring it back to the point that, oil and gas companies knew that climate change would have these impacts and they lied about it. And now we're feeling these impacts that have been kind of laid out in these documents and we could have avoided. So
yeah, Kelly, I'm glad that you brought that up because that's like a perfect sort of transition into a lot of the other work that we do at CCI. But, a huge amount of information and investigative reporting and journalism is out there about what big oil and gas companies knew about climate change and when they knew it. And this research is going back 60 years. They had some of the best climate science programs in the world. And so a lot of the adaptations and then the costs that we're looking at in these reports and more were actually predicted. I mean, not to the dollar amount, but they were predicted by the climate science programs that companies like Exxon and Shell were actually running. And so that really, I think, like Kelly said, they knew that this was going to happen and they didn't do anything to stop it. In fact, they lied about it. And now we're in this position now. So that's sort of the other half of our work is sort of taking these costs so we can start this conversation about who should pay.
I'm glad I'm back. Thank you. And I feel like I came at the perfect time, which is, who pays for this? And I'm someone that really promotes that everybody has to do their part. We'll should try to take public transit and walk more and bike more and plant our own trees and have our own, advocacy, in our communities. But it's pretty clear that we didn't create the problem. That in fact we have been bamboozled into being part of the problem. Like for example, with plastics, which is something that is almost unthinkable, not to use plastic. Everything around us has something to do, with petrochemicals and plastic. So, can we talk a little more about and this is something that sometimes people like, oh, I don't think that is really true. Like I have heard people say this to me that like, oh, polluters, no, it's not their fault. But I think you are very versed on speaking about how this was actually intentional, how they
Very.
know for many years, maybe since day one, and they have been buying bogus research and scientists into convincing us that no, so which gets very confusing for the consumer. So if you can talk a little bit about, um, the part where the fossil fuel industry knew and how they're responsible for the mess that we're in basically right now.
One of my favorite things to talk about. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's research that's out there that's been made available to the public. It goes back to the early 1960s. And it shows that these companies knew that some of the words they used were catastrophic. And when they're talking about the effect that climate change would have specifically from burning their products, from the use of their products. And there were a number of these studies. There's memos. The executives were well aware. And instead of really, transitioning their business model, and they had the opportunity to be leaders in a clean transition, they saw that any kind of work to any kind of progress on climate policy would be a threat to their bottom line,
Mhm.
would threaten their product or their profits. And so they pivoted, and this happened in kind of the late 80s. Up until then, they were actually investing, and now I should say, up till now, they've been investing in actually protecting their own assets, like their offshore drilling rigs from sea level rise and other climate impacts that they knew were going to happen. And this research has been proven time and again to be startlingly accurate. I mean, the projections that they made are just totally on point with what we've seen today and 10 years ago. I mean, we're seeing exactly, they were very good scientists, and that is their own
Mhm.
quote. But in the 80s, they really pivoted away and started this, essentially one of the biggest campaigns of denial and deception and delay tactics that we've ever seen from an industry. They hired phony scientists. They worked with PR firms on huge PR campaigns, really trying to emphasize the uncertainty in climate science so that we would call into question. And then our policymakers would be a little bit too nervous to really pass anything. So the effect just cannot be overstated. And now, here we are. I think there's a lot of progress being made, especially at the local level, but we've missed a lot of opportunities to pass some really comprehensive climate policy. And that is 100% a result of the efforts of the fossil fuel industry, their front groups, their trade associations, hammering this
Mhm.
home, this message of uncertainty. And, this is just what's too uncertain to actually do anything about.
It's gonna cost us too much. It's going to,
100%.
the lights are gonna go off. People
Yeah.
are gonna die. I,
Yeah. We're
I
losing
personally
energy.
have heard those arguments out
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
And we've seen now, I think, in more recent years, another shift, which is they're kind of out of the denial at this phase because they kind of have to be. we know what's happening. But what they really shifted to is more of a push into greenwashing and duplicity. And while they say, we are doing algae and we are doing carbon capture and storage and all of these sort of what we now know because that are more like false solutions than true solutions, But they're positioning themselves as, these innovators of clean energy. But in fact, we see their annual reports. They are doubling down and they're expanding their drilling operations, and they're profiting more than ever. So this sort of, double speak is really what we're starting to see more of. There was actually just a hearing in the federal government, in the Senate, to try to expose further what the kind of some of the more modern tactics that these companies are using. So that's a kind of brief. I mean, we could talk for hours about this, but that's a very brief history up till now of kind of the knowledge. And now also, communities know this and they're taking them to court all over the country, including the state of California.
So what's next? What is next in terms of what people can do, how they can get involved, or if someone is listening or watching this live stream today and learning for the first time about, oh, I didn't even think that there would be other, cause of the climate crisis to us, and in our city or personally. So what someone can do as an individual to support these efforts and to bring more light to this issue?
Yeah. So a couple things. I think that the more costs that we have out there and that people are talking about, the better. So talking to, I think, especially your local municipal elected who represents you at the city council level or at the county level. Are you tracking these costs? Do you
I have
know
been talking about this for far too long. Yes.
But, asking those questions, how much is climate change costing us? What have we paid, thus far to protect communities from this? Because once we have those dollars, then we can have that conversation about who should pay. The second thing I'd mention is that there are now 8 states, and actually now 9. The state of Michigan just yesterday announced they intend to sue Big Oil for lying about climate change, recover the costs. But Attorney General Bonta in California has filed suit against them as well as a number of communities throughout the state of California. I think there are over 40 municipalities across the United States that have brought these lawsuits. And like I said, 8 and pending 9 states. So I think our website does have a map of where all these cases are. And so identifying whether you have a case, if you have a case, champion it. These communities are up against one of the biggest industries, most powerful.
And this is the climateintegrity.org website.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Climateintegrity.org. You'll see a button to click for cases. You'll be able to see if you have a case. So like I said, championing it, letting your municipal officials know that you support them, that you're here for them, you'll defend it. If you don't have a case, talk to your elected officials about what that could mean for your community. I mean, we are facing, like Kelly and I said, huge costs, and communities shouldn't have to face that alone, especially when they didn't cause the problem. So I think those are 2 great options. And, follow, I would, of course, put a plug in to follow us on our social media. You can find all of that on our website and our newsletter as well. We will always send up updates and developments in this space.
All right, friends, this is the opportunity that we have to get really activated and get involved, because the climate crisis doesn't only affect our air. It doesn't only, create seawater rise. And if you're still thinking that that's something that it doesn't affect you, that is out there, that is not for you, well, I hope that this conversation has at least planted some seeds in your heart for you to, broaden your view about the cause, the individual cause and collective cause of the climate crisis. And I'm curious about the IPCC report that is probably coming out pretty soon, if it's not already out, to see what the scientists are saying about where we're at in terms of climate change and and emissions and such. And I'm just very encouraged that an organization like yours have, like, the climate integrity, the CCI has taking the task to quantify the cost of climate change in cities like the county of Los Angeles, which is one of the largest counties in the country, and we're talking about billions of dollars of losses, and how we can advocate for those losses to become opportunities in our communities, so that we can bring investments and also show the way to elected officials about how we can invest in climate policy, and it can be a win-win, for all of us. Any other last findings that you would like the listeners and people that are watching the live stream right now to learn before we go?
I would just say, we're winning, which is really encouraging. I mean, these cases have been held up in procedural battles for years now, and they are starting to get closer and closer to trial. So, yes, we're up against one of the biggest, baddest industries out there, but you cannot overstate the power of organizing and of also just holding industries accountable when they break the law. That's why we have laws. So we are winning. It's really exciting. And I really, really thank you for having us on to discuss one of our
Of,
favorite subjects.
of course, of course. And Kelly, in terms of your research, any last findings, any last numbers that you would like, any talking points that you would like to let us know before we go?
Um, no, I feel like I pretty much covered it. If you guys are interested in any of the more specific findings about like a specific impact, all of that information is available in the report, and you can also do a data download, so you can find your municipality within Los Angeles County and see what it's costing your municipality itself. Because the numbers we gave were top line, 12.5 billion for across Los Angeles County within the municipalities. So I would just encourage you, if you're interested, you can look into your municipality, and I'm always happy to answer questions. So feel free to reach out via email.
Absolutely, because $12.5 billion by the end of 2040 could be reinvested in LA County. And imagine the type of things that we could do in our communities, especially in communities of color and low income communities that are often most affected by climate change. I want to thank you both for being here, for taking. Wow, it's been an hour. It felt like 10 minutes to me. Like this is a great topic. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
for being with us and for educating us and giving us some hope too. I got to say, after working on this issue for so long, I can be a little cynic sometimes and like nobody cares, but it's this type of conversations that bring me back to our collective effort and how much we can get done when we work together. So thank you so much, and I hope that you come back with more whenever you want.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much. We really appreciate it.
Of course, of course. All right. So that was our friends from the climate, the CCI. And I want to thank everyone for, for being with us today. You can watch this live stream later on in my Patreon, and you can listen to this podcast in any of the podcast channels out there. If you want to be a supporter and join our movement to make our community better, please visit my Patreon at Aura Vasquez. You can always reach out to ask any questions that you might have and any comments or suggestions. The conversation always continues offline. So thank you so much, everyone. And until the next one, bye bye.